Welcome to Sterling Visionary Voices, the podcast dedicated to bringing you diverse, innovative leadership insights and actionable strategies for success. Join hosts Laura McNeil and Bob Medeiros as they explore the art and science of role model leadership through thought-provoking conversations with real professionals. Whether you're a seasoned leader or aspiring to excellence, Sterling Visionary Voices is your guide to navigating the complexities of your leadership journey.
Sometimes treasured relationships seem to sour immediately, almost overnight, leaving us scratching our heads, wondering what happened. When this happens in our personal lives, it can be emotionally draining and sometimes devastating to recover from. When it happens at work, it can pose even more daunting challenges, especially for leaders, since leaders are supposed to be the trusted motivators and supporters for the troops. Lou Holt said, "We have two ears and one mouth so that we could listen to twice as much as what we speak." And in Jim Collins' Good to Great book, his research confirmed that the common characteristic of leaders that rise to greatness is the ability to remain humble at all times. It's my pleasure to introduce former Tallahassee City Manager and now owner of Reflect Excellence, LLC, Sterling Counsel, Examiner, and Leader, Gordon Klein. Gordon exhibits both of these traits. Not only is he humble, but he is a great listener, which are the two skill sets and traits that I admire the most about Gordon. Welcome, Gordon. Really super happy that you could be with us today. And I honestly have to admit that I was really surprised when you shared part of this experience with me earlier. So you hired a star, and that star turned into a behavioral leadership challenge, if not nightmare. Interested in finding out what happened and how you handled the situation.
I'd be glad to, Laura. It's a little long, so everyone take a sip of their coffee and buckle up. But I do strongly believe that leaders sharing experience is important. And I look at it this way. You know, the old saying, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man a fish, he eats for a life. All of us have gone through our experiences and had failures that we learned from. We learn from them individually. I think sharing the failures also helps other leaders learn and not go through them, as well as sharing your successes. So this is about a time when I pretty much failed miserably in an area I didn't expect to. But I learned some key facts that allowed me to continue to grow and become a better leader. In 2018, the nation was going through a financial crisis. I was working with the city of Tallahassee, running their database shop, supporting databases throughout the city. I'd been with the city for close to 20 years at that time. I'd handled their debt, I'd handled their investments, I'd been one of their internal audit team. So I had a broad base of experience. But what the executive management decided to do is the city addressed this financial crisis nationwide was to consolidate some departments. And they took a water department, a sewer department, a gas department, and a stormwater department and shoved them all together and called them underground utilities. Now, quite frankly, and I knew guys that worked in these departments, those departments were competitive and not necessarily friendly competition. So as that new department was formed, and that new department allowed them to share resources and share staff and save money, so the city was able to go through the recession without any layoffs or any issues like that. There was a lot of storming in that project management perspective. And for the first couple of years, it was rather contentious there, and I really admire the leader that brought them through that. But in the financial and administrative area, the leader that initially got that position turned out to be a toxic leader. And she was eventually replaced with someone who had sights on a different job and was there for a year almost as a placeholder. So we come to 2010, this now the largest department in the city, having hundreds of $1 million budget, was facing a vacancy in their key financial leadership position. And I was pretty much told, you're going to go and work there. So I did. On the financial side, there was only 3 positions handling the finance and the budgets for what used to be 4 departments. It would have had maybe 3 to 4 people per department. The person I was replacing was leaving. He was taking his right-hand person with him, and the remaining analyst I had to help me pull together what I needed to pull together immediately had only been with the city for a month and had never worked in municipal government or utilities before. Good man, new to the job. So I accepted the position, not that I was really given much of a choice. I was voluntold, but I didn't mind the increase in pay and in title. I had to prepare close to 30 separate budgets within 3 months, and most departments submit 2. I had 2 rate studies going on, and rate studies in the utility industry drive what you're able to do for the next 5 years. And I had the majority of my staff, the administrative aides and assistants that really run any business, were heads down defensive from having suffered through a toxic manager in the past. I had 2 incredible feats due in several months and basically no staff, but someone that was just learning. So my first task was to advertise and hire. What I was looking for was someone that either knew rate studies inside and out, and I could teach them the budget side later, or someone that knew the city's budget and financial practices inside and out, and I could teach them rate studies later, because I didn't expect to find them both. And I didn't, but I had an applicant that was perfect for the rate study side. She had been a consultant for 20 years in the utility industry doing rate studies as an independent consultant. She was an industrial engineer. She got her master's from Harvard. For the most recent 10 years, she'd been running her own business. She ticked all of the boxes in the interview. I felt very confident I could focus on preparing the budgets and just give her the information and oversee her doing the rate studies. There's only one hitch, in that she was living in Key West and didn't want to leave Key West until she sold her house. Now remember, this was 8 years pre-COVID. Remote work was not as popular as it is now. But I made it work. We made her an offer, and we made an agreement that until she sold her house for up to the first quarter, she would continue to live in Key West, and we would use Skype and the telephone and FTP, and she would tackle the rate study side with guidance and information I gave her, and I would tackle the budget side. And that went well. That went incredibly well. She was able to work and get the rate studies done extremely well. And one rate study is a lot of work. We were doing 2 of them simultaneously. And she was doing it for a company she'd never worked for before, but it went really well. And I got the budgets done on time. And we learned some lessons about how to do the remote work. But her house did sell, and she packed up everything she owned and moved to Tallahassee, a new city for her, moved to being a government worker when she'd been a consultant for the past 20 years, changed her life, came to work for us, came on board. I was extremely pleased with the work she did during the rate studies. She came on board. I made her the supervisor of the other person that now had 4 months worth of experience. And as she started a new job, I gave her assignments, projects we had ongoing that I thought would help her learn the city and learn the utilities. One of them was we were ISO 9001 certified, and we have to do an audit of all of our operating practices every year internally. I put her in charge of the audit. She put together a team of 20 people from around the utilities. She led the audit. She wrote the audit report. She did a thorough and professional job, impressed everybody. There were a number of other one-off assignments I gave her that were like that. I was extremely pleased with this person, with this employee. And she was contributing, great deal contributing. And I meet with my staff very regularly, and I was giving her feedback on her performance. I was giving her very positive feedback on her performance because she earned it. But there were some behaviors that were starting to happen that were a little inconsistent with what I expected. The city had recently adopted a what's called a fast track policy, where we were really trying to get capital dollar monies into construction in the field to boost the local economy. So we had put a process in place where if we're actually going to be doing a construction project, a lot of the checks and balances were fast tracked. Permits were done for those projects twice as fast. Any financial approvals were done twice as fast. Literally changed some laws that said, okay, you can start on the project and apply for the permits after the fact. Now, in the interview, she had talked about how well she worked under pressure. And as a consultant in 20 years, where you have to get the project done on the client's time scale and present everything to their board of directors or their commission, she had the background to do that. So I thought this was great. Our role was a financial approval of the purchase of signing of a contract for the purchase material for these fast track projects. Everything crossed our desk to make sure that the money was available and it was the appropriate money. So the rule that had gone into place was that basically once that paperwork was ready for approval, we had 4 hours to turn it around. Quite frankly, if it was correct, it took 5 minutes. If it was incorrect, it took 15 minutes. It was just we couldn't set it to the side and do other work and get to it at the end of the day. The fast track meant fast track, and we did it. I had been approving those. I had called her in every time I approved one, so she learned how to approve one, so I gave that to her. I signed that to her. She was glad for the responsibility, but the first time one hit her desk, she lost her calm. She was clearly stressed and clearly upset and paced up and down. And how can they ask me to do that? And I don't know how to do this. And she did, of course, know how to do it. But it was out of character, and she did it. She got it done, and she was upset at the next one. But eventually, she got into the rhythm and continued and did them well. But that was out of character. Other things that she was doing that seemed a little bit out of character. She was leading a team to come up with a new vendor contract. We had a city warehouse that stocked our materials, but we were trying to get out of the city warehouse because if we needed a particular pump, those guys didn't know the right pump to buy, and often we had the wrong parts. So we were getting a contract with a local vendor. We would bid it to stock the parts for us, not just to buy from them, but they would hold them in inventory, the ones that we needed, so they're immediately available if something breaks. So she was a leading team for that. And then word got back to me that in some of those team meetings, she was complaining about how she has to do all the work and I don't do anything. Now, quite frankly, she knew about 10% of my job. My responsibilities were expanded beyond her. And at that point in time, the rate studies were done and everything was sound. The budget was done, so everything was sound. I was working on helping the admin staff recover from a previous toxic manager. And I also played a role in helping with the finance in other departments, which she didn't know, but I'd been with the city for 30 years and I was often called to other departments to help them out with their finances. So she was not talking favorably about her boss in meetings. I didn't like that, but that was fine. Often when I would tell her how to gather information from our systems, I need you to run this query, write this query in our financial system to get this project data to do this analysis. She questioned whether I knew how to write the query and get the right data. And I would tell her, this is how you do this to get this accounting data. And then she would go back to her office and then I would hear her, we were next door to each other, call accounting and ask them to get the data for her to double check what I told her. And she did that with purchasing and she did that with HR. And I'll admit, and this is not a positive reflection on me, but sometimes I took some pleasure in the fact I would hear her call HR. Can you get me this data? And the person in HR would say, sure, I can do that. Can you give me a couple hours? And then they would call me and ask me how to do it because I had actually implemented the HR and financial systems. So there was a host of things that were going on that were behaviors that I didn't understand, I didn't expect. She'd done an excellent job with the EMS, and when we had a celebratory event and we were calling people up to the stage to thank them for their excellent job and give them a handshake and a congratulations from the big boss and even a little award. When she was called up, she left the event rather than come up to the stage. So little inconsistencies in behavior. Now I said that we had our regular one-on-ones, and we did. And she'd shared with me some of the things in her personal life, and I knew she was going through a personal healthcare scare, which thank goodness was a misdiagnosis and a second opinion took care of. But I knew she had some some personal stresses, so I was cutting her a lot of slack. But at the end of the 6-month period, it was time to do her probationary evaluation, and I was working on that. And I take evaluation seriously, and I wrote up a thorough evaluation, and she got very high scores. Her work product, I think, was beyond compare. Now, at the city, when you evaluate an employee, then you have to review that with the next higher level of management. In my case, with the manager of the utilities department. And you do that before you give the employee the evaluation. Yeah, your dialogue with the manager needs to happen before you give the employee the evaluation, so that no one is thrown under a bus if there was some disagreement. And I was shocked that there was some disagreement. My boss, being a very active manager that he was, had also heard that she was not necessarily publicly fully supportive of me as a manager, that she had complained. And being who he is, he'd asked some questions, and he thought I should give her a poor evaluation, extend her probation, or even consider letting her go.
Interesting.
It was. I was floored that he thought that. He agreed with every positive thing I said, but I was focused on her work and her work product, and he was focused on her team interactions more than I was. And we had to go back and forth. We went back and forth for a while, and he and I debated what that should be. He really wanted me to change some things I really didn't, and he ultimately relented. He said, "You're one of my senior leaders. Any consequence of taking her off probation is on your shoulders as it is, and I trust you to do that." So he'd agreed. Finalizing the evaluation to go over with her, that she was, one, going to be given great accolades because she did great work and come off probation and be a former student. But because of that back and forth with the boss, even though this was a month before the end of her evaluation, by policy, I was now 2 days late in giving it to her. The policy, quite frankly, no one ever really paid attention to or followed, but she did, and apparently it was bothering her. So at the lunch where my boss agreed, okay, I can't argue with her performance. You think she should get an excellent evaluation. I think these are an issue. And I agreed with his issues, but I hadn't discussed them with her in our one-on-ones. And I didn't think that, I don't believe in surprises in evaluation. So that I would give her the evaluation on her work, and I'd say, this is what we work on next week. He'd agreed to that, but when he got back to the office, she was in his office. And she just dumped on him all of the things that she was afraid I had criticized her for in the evaluation. She had no idea what was in the evaluation, but it was 2 days late, and apparently she was afraid I had just ripped her up one side down the other, and she was going to get a bad evaluation. She was going to get fired.
Without reading the evaluation first?
All right. See the position I'm in. I thought I had done everything right as a manager, and I thought I gave her credit where credit is due, but somehow we were seeing things from a completely different perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's interesting you say, because I think she recognized that her behaviors were negatively impacting.
I think in some case she did. And while I recognize there were some behaviors that I thought we should sit down and work on, compared to her successes, they were minor. And until the blow up with the boss, until she basically went over my head and supported every fear my boss had about her future performance, she was on good grounds, and we would have worked it through. Quite frankly, between she and I, we had developed a toxic environment that I didn't quite recognize, and she did. So here's what we did. Again, my boss, great leader. This young lady that I had hired, very experienced professional, and I'd been in the business for a long time, but we all agreed to go to counseling jointly. All three of us. My boss, who's not even part of the dynamic, said, "I will go with you." And we had a counselor on staff, someone I continue to work with, post working with the city. And one of the things she did was she gave us independently and talked with us the Harrison assessment. Now, the Harrison assessment is one of those behavioral profiles like the Myers-Briggs, the in-depth version of the Myers-Briggs, or DISC. I'd taken those profiles before. I'd used those profiles before. But I'd never taken them as seriously as I did this time. And here's what the situation was. Of course, I had relied upon her, and what she told me in the interview is those were her behavioral traits. And I had relied upon the behavioral relationship we had developed working for those first 3 months over Skype. And I think the story is important now because back then, face-to-face, now, post-COVID world, this over Skype, over Teams, over is now a bigger part of the relationship. But there were some tendencies of hers that I did not understand. I had interpreted exactly often. The big takeaway for me is realizing that those behavioral assessments give you an indication of how a person behaves when they're not thinking about behaving. And that's the key part. What they tell you in the interview is what they're going to tell you because that's what they think you want to hear. What they do in front of a presentation to the board of directors, they're thinking about behaving. When you only meet them an hour or so a day on a phone call or a Skype meeting, they are thinking about behaving on that meeting because they're meeting with the boss.
Right.
Well, in this case, it was an eye-opener for me. For one thing, she preferred strongly to receive praise in private. So when I did things like call her up on the stage and publicly recognize her, in my mind, I'm rewarding this person. I'm building engagement. In her mind, I was punishing her. When I didn't sit down and sooner explain to her aspects of my job that were well beyond her role, I supervised multiple functions. She thought she was doing all the work and I was goofing off. I thought she was doing a great job and I could focus on the more strategic elements of my job. There were a number of those instances where my vision of her and her work preference based on learning her through Skype, learning her through video calls versus once we're in an environment and see each other 8 hours a day and work with teams 8 hours a day was wrong. I misunderstood her, and quite frankly, she misunderstood me. One of the things that I learned through this process and with speaking with her and looking at the behavioral assessment is she wanted her feedback to be very direct, very blunt. She would not mind if I threw in some curse words when she was 5 minutes late, told her she should be on time. My preferred management style at that point in time was to be very diplomatic because I was easing some pain from, she was in charge of a 1-person shop. I always had another 20-person shop that was just still, it had been under a dictatorial leader that had really damaged their engagement with their job. And I was rebuilding that. There was a host of things that had I paid more attention to her behaviors when she wasn't thinking about behaving and respected more of the things that rewarded or challenged her than I did. One of the things that we turned out, she loves deadlines and tight deadlines as long as she's the one that set them. So if she created the project plan and set the deadlines, by golly, she's never going to miss them. If someone else imposed the deadline on her, that was incredibly stressful for her. And I was giving her the tight deadline stuff because she stressed how good she was with tight deadlines. Again, I'm thinking I'm playing to her strengths. She thinks I'm just torturing her. That's basically the story. And we worked through it and we had a good relationship at the end, although it took as long to rebuild the relationship as it did to damage it. But I thought that was an important story because I do think that managers do need to pay more attention and have more open discussion with those behavioral tendencies that someone has, those behavioral preferences someone has, especially in terms of building engagement. I've worked with many managers that think that their employees are engaged by the same thing that engages them. It's not necessarily true. You have to get to know what their priorities are, which are different from yours. And I thought this was an important story at this point in time because the world has moved from face-to-face office to more of the video conferencing and video meetings. And you have to make an extra effort an extra effort to understand the other person's priorities, preferences, and dislikes. It's not going to be as apparent as seeing them as often as you would if you shared an office. That was an epiphany for me, and that changed the way that I related to staff moving forward, and it changed the way I hired.
That is so true. Connecting with people starts at the hiring stage and it never stops. It continues throughout the entirety of the relationship and the engagement. In order to motivate people effectively, we really need to understand the foundation from which they're coming from. Great insight. Well, it's really, really been interesting listening to your story. Like I said at the beginning, Gordon, I was floored when you mentioned you had a challenge with an employee, and I couldn't wait to hear the rest of the story because it was an antithesis of how I would describe you as a seasoned leader, humble, great listener. As I mentioned, I've taken that to the test, but thank you very much for having the comfort to come on and share that with us, and really appreciate it.
Certainly my pleasure, Laura.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Sterling Visionary Voices, Insights for Role Model Leadership from the Sterling Council. Discover more and connect with us at sterlingvisionaryvoices.com.